If anyone were to ask you to name an Australian Spurs player, the easiest answer is Patty Mills. But what if I told you instead of him, we're going to talk about a player who only averaged 1.7 points per game his entire NBA career instead? Of course, your first thought may be, why the hell would we do that? But when you look at his stats internationally, a bigger picture is formed. And this comment underneath my last Across the Globe video summarizes that disconnect perfectly, stating, Andrew Gaze is the GOAT of Aussie basketball, but he's probably remembered as being a bench warmer on the Spurs' '99 championship, or being on the Seton Hall Final Four run back in the 80s. And that's really what Across the Globe is about. The NBA tends to dominate the way we look and talk about basketball history, but sometimes you have to step outside the league to find players and stories that were never getting the same attention over in the States. Players whose NBA careers might look completely ordinary, even though that doesn't come close to explaining who they actually were in the basketball world as a whole. So shout out to Farkman for putting Andrew Gaze on my radar, because that's exactly what this series is for. So if there's an international player that you think deserves more attention, be sure to put their name in the comments and tell me why. This video came directly from one of you guys, and I'd love for the next one to happen in the same way. Andrew Gaze's legacy is one that starts before he was even born, because just like other legends, his last name carried a lot of weight before he ever even picked up a basketball himself. Lindsay Gaze had represented Australia and coached the Australian national team at 4 different Olympics and would eventually enter the FIBA Hall of Fame as a coach. So when Andrew Gaze turned 18, he played on the Melbourne Tigers, coached by his dad. So naturally, there were accusations of nepotism in the same vein as when the Lakers used their pick for Bronny because of LeBron. People initially suspected the only reason Andrew was on the team was because of his father. So Andrew's first goal immediately became to silence that criticism. In Gaze's first season in Australia's NBPL, not to be confused with the NBA's predecessor, the American NBPL, Andrew averaged 29.1 points, 6.7 rebounds, and 4.1 assists per game. He won Rookie of the Year, and that same year he was already representing Australia at the Olympics in 1984. For an NBA comparison, this sort of dynamic was very similar to a dynamic in story where Steph Curry would enter the league already being given big expectations under Del Curry, only for Steph to then become more popular than his father. Except in this context, Del Curry would also be a 4-time Olympic coach in the Hall of Fame. If we go back to Andrew though, 29.1 points as a rookie already sounds insane. But lest us forget, this was but the beginning of his career. Fast forward 3 years to 1987, and Gaze was putting up an absolutely absurd 44.1 points per game. At 21 years old, he was already literally putting up Wilt-level numbers, still staying at the highest single-season scoring average in Australian NBPL history. Even better was his shooting efficiency to get there, because it wasn't 44 points by just chucking up the ball, but instead 53% from the field, 39% from 3, and totaling to a 63% true shooting percentage, all while still also putting up 8.2 rebounds and 5.8 assists per game, including a 60-point game to top all of it off. So with all this, it sounds like Andrew Gaze was an absolute god. With his dad as coach, he single-handedly carried the team to a championship, right? Well, not exactly. Melbourne actually finished dead last in the league, winning only 3 games and losing the remaining 23. Now, I know where your mind will immediately jump to. Andrew Gaze was a ball hog, stat patter, and his stats looked great in isolation while his team struggled to get opportunities to win. And I would argue that NBA discourse has basically trained us in that way of thinking, that when somebody puts up monster numbers on a terrible team, the first response is always that they're empty stats. Although, it was actually quite the opposite, which is why this series is so important. Melbourne, unfortunately, was just legitimately a bad team. They had the second worst defense in the league, only 1.2 points away from being dead last in defense. And by doing so, they were giving up roughly 20 more points than they were scoring. And reports have come out that that team has literally gone on record themselves saying that their strategy was along the lines of just give Andrew the ball, almost resembling Jokic on the early Nuggets days. In those years with crazy stats like 44 points per game, Andrew was playing 47.8 minutes out of a 48-minute game. Meaning he wasn't a ball hog or taking opportunities away, but literally that he was the only player that could score on that team and they could not afford to take him off of the court. But afterwards, it was time to see how Andrew Gaze's game fared in America, and so he went to college. This was seen as sort of a peculiar move. If he was already a professional in Australia, why would he go through a college program in America if he could just be set for life staying in his country? In any case, he joined Seton Hall for the 1988 to 1989 season, and it was the perfect way for him to properly show off his skills as all of the variables were changed. He wasn't relying on his dad as a coach, and he was going up against American competition rather than the Australian NBPL. And he was also playing with teammates who could keep up with his game in order to get more assists or other opportunities across the team. After starting in 37 games, Andrew Gaze averaged 13.6 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 2.9 assists, while shooting 42.5% from off of 221 attempts, going 94 for 221, which mathematically is about 5.8 three-point attempts per game across the 38 games he played, meaning that he had a higher three-point percentage than Curry during his college years, although Curry ended up having a slightly higher volume of shots. Andrew Gaze's stats certainly weren't the 44 points per game anymore, but it still showed that he could perform efficiently enough when removed from Australia. Then, in March Madness, one of the biggest basketball stages, especially for college basketball, Seton Hall made it through its opening rounds, with Gaze putting up 16 points against Indiana in the Sweet 16, followed by 19 against UNLV in the Elite 8, and then they went up against Duke in the Final Four, where Gaze hit 4 threes, finishing the game with 20 points, and sending Seton Hall to the first national championship game in school history. Unfortunately for Gaze, that last March Madness championship never came. Seton Hall faced Michigan in the championship game, and Gaze himself struggled, finishing with only 5 points. However, the game was still very, very close. Seton Hall took Michigan to overtime, where they eventually lost only 80 to 79 points, with Rumeal Robinson hitting 2 free throws in the last final seconds. Years later, Andrew Gaze himself would state that this game was a giant what if. Even still, how deep Seton Hall went in the tourney showed Gaze's ability to adapt his game to America, and that he could still be efficient at that level. But still, we are massive steps away from the claim that he was the GOAT of Aussie basketball, as the comment said. I mean, if he's such an Australian legend, then why in the context of Australia have we only discussed when his team was 3-23? Sure, he holds the highest single season scoring record, but that was only one good season. Well, actually, it was 7 seasons. Andrew Gaze owns 7 of the 10 highest single-season scoring averages in NBPL history. He had the 44.1 points from 1987 sitting at number 1, but he also averaged 38.8 in 1991, 37.6 in 1990, 36.9 twice, 34.5 in 1989, and another 33.9 in 1995. On top of that, after his Seton Hall years, Melbourne actually started succeeding as well. By 1989, they had jumped from the bottom of the league to a winning record, while Gaze was still averaging over 34 points and 7 assists per game, which again botches the idea that he needed to stop scoring for Melbourne to stop winning, because that simply never really happened. The roster around him simply just got better. The successes afterwards just began to snowball. In 1991, he won NBPL MVP. In 1993, Melbourne actually won the championship, and then 4 years later won another championship, all with his dad still as coach as well. To the point that today, just as the NBA has named the Finals MVP the Bill Russell Trophy, and the Rookie of the Year the Wilt Chamberlain Trophy, and so on, the Australian NBPL MVP is called the Andrew Gaze Trophy, while the Coach of the Year is the Lindsay Gaze Trophy. This would spark more friendly sports banter about what Lindsay Gaze was better known at, being a FIBA Hall of Fame coach or simply being Andrew Gaze's dad. By the end of his NBPL career, Gaze had won 7 MVPs, more than anyone else in league history. He had 14 scoring titles, 15 All-NBPL first-team selections, 2 championships, and finished with 18,908 career points across 612 games. Mathematically, that's about 31 points per game for more than 2 decades. So now, we have done our homework to call him the GOAT of Australian basketball. Basketball.com.australia itself lists Gaze number 1 amongst the greatest players in league history. But even then, we still haven't even touched on his Olympics resume. As previously mentioned, Andrew Gaze represented Australia as a teenager all the way back in 1984. That eventually would become 5 more Olympic appearances: 1984, 1988, 1992, and 1996, and finally the Sydney Olympics in 2000. And not only was he showing longevity, but he was also doing it while keeping the same efficiency. At the 1988 Olympics, he averaged 23.9 points per game. In 1996, he was putting up 23.8. And even by the Sydney Olympics in 2000, when he was already 35 years old, Gage still averaged 19.9 points per game. Across those 5 Olympics, his total score was 789 points. For reference, Paul Gasol had 649. Luis Scola had 591. Manu Ginobili had 523. Meaning he had over 140 more points than Paul Gasol, and over 200 more than Manu Ginobili. To this day, only Oscar Schmidt has scored more points in the history of men's Olympic basketball. But similar to Melbourne's early years, even with his individual successes, Australia always finished just short of bronze at 4th or worse every single time. But by 2000, his importance to Australian basketball had become bigger than whether or not that medal ever came. Because when Sydney hosted the Olympics, Australia had hundreds of athletes representing the country, but only one person could carry the Australian flag into the opening ceremony: Andrew Gaze. That alone can tell you his impact more than that 1.7 points in the NBA. Just like how Sofo inspired Greece despite his stats, Andrew Gaze was doing the same. Andrew Gaze had become such a national star and icon to Australia that he was on Dancing with the Stars, and when Australia achieved that same success. Nearly every reference to him, if you search up just his name on the internet, references Gaze as the best NBPL player of all time. As time went on, it was time for Andrew Gaze to take that next step and enter the NBA. He actually went undrafted before signing with the Washington Bullets, where he played only 7 games before going back to Australia for the next 4 years.
On a cold morning in a college gymnasium outside of Washington, Andrew Gaze practiced for his NBA debut, a 10-day tryout with the Washington Bullets. 5 years ago, after starring in college basketball, Gaze almost made it to the Seattle Supersonics, but that didn't work out. Just no practice time and little chance even to get to know his teammates. It was a tough introduction to the NBA. But 13,000 fans saw the promise in this sharp shooter from Australia.
Andrew Gaze hits his first NBA shot. It's a two-pointer.
Gaze scored 4 points and helped the Bullets to a 100-93 victory.
It was very exciting and enjoyed it immensely. It was a good experience. I played so much more than what I expected to play. It was gave plenty of opportunity, but I think tonight it was more or less just trying to let the guys do their thing and give the guys, the starters, some rest and not push the issue or be on my own agenda, you know, just trying to fit in and do the right thing. And luckily things worked out for the best as far as the team was concerned.
Chalk and cheese. I think that the league here, you're talking about bigger, quicker, more talented athletic bodies, and so I mean it really is a fair way apart, but you know, hopefully my skills in some way, if there's a role for me here, then perhaps I can start.
And so once again, most people would assume that's where his NBA career ended. A very brief sprint that doesn't even make a dent in the graph of NBA history. However, as a result of him playing in the Olympics, Pop and the Spurs noticed him and watched his career with great interest. When Andrew Gaze was told the team was scouting him, he legitimately responded that he thought it was a prank, and that he was too old by this point. By then, Andrew Gaze was 33 years old, so to translate for the kids these days, Andrew Gaze himself said that he felt too much like an unk to still feel valuable to a team. Yet, the Spurs still called him, quote, one of the premier shooters in the world. Not just Australia, but the world. However, when Gaze joined the team, it was during the 1999 roster, meaning they already had Tim Duncan and David Robinson. And again, by his own admission, Gaze was 33 years old. As a result, he only played 19 games, totaling 58 minutes and 21 points, and not a single second in the playoffs. Even Andrew himself later joked his contribution to that championship team was bordering on irrelevant.
In 1999, you end up finding yourself on the Spurs and played with some greats there.
Greg Popovich was very honest and said, listen, I don't know how much you're going to play. I think that you're going to be the ultimate insurance policy. If something happens, that I have confidence and faith that you can come in and play and give us that perimeter shooting. No one got hurt. We remain injury-free. Oh, I didn't get to play too much.
Have you still got the ring?
I do have the ring. I've never worn the ring. I feel a bit guilty about the ring because I had very little to do with it. But as you know, when you're playing, you've got to play your role. And that can be just with morale, making sure that you're at a level that keeps pushing the other guys. All those things you've got to do in order to have the success. So I got a ring. Look up the most irrelevant player on a championship winning team, and there is a smiling face of me there, very happy.
However, the Spurs did win the championship. And with Andrew Gaze on the roster, that technically meant that Andrew Gaze had now just become an NBA champion. And that creates maybe the funniest contradiction of this entire story. Andrew Gaze has an NBA championship ring, and yet somehow that championship might be one of the least important or relevant accomplishments when you're trying to explain how good he actually was. And if you focus only on his NBA stats, you see he played 26 career games, with 0 starts and 1.7 points per game. And none of that is wrong, but it's still laughably incomplete context when compared to everything else stated in this video. When we started this comment seemed like an outrageous claim to make, but now you have the information to look back at and see. As we stated before, 7 MVPs, 14 scoring titles, nearly 19,000 points, 7 of the 10 highest scoring averages in league history, and so on. And eventually, he would become an NBA championship, thrown in there almost as a footnote. Suddenly, the GOAT of Australian basketball doesn't seem crazy at all, which once again is why I started this series across the globe. These videos aren't meant to be that Andrew Gaze and others are some hidden or forgotten NBA superstar that didn't get fair NBA minutes they deserved, as again, Gaze himself said that he barely mattered to the 1999 Spurs championship. But more so, the point is that NBA history is not what encompasses all basketball history. And so once again, thank you to Farkman for recommending this, as Andrew Gaze's story was certainly fun for me to research, and again is quite literally a hallmark symbol of what this series represents. So please, keep the recommendations coming. If there's another international player whose story you think gets completely lost when people look at their NBA career, or somebody who never made it in the NBA at all but is an international legend, drop their name down below and tell me why I should look into them. Because again, this video came directly from you guys, and I'd love for the next one to happen in the same exact way. And if somehow you ended up missing the big Sofo video, that's literally the video where this comment came from in order to make the video you just watched. So if you want another example of how much basketball history we miss out on by only looking at the NBA, I'll see y'all over in that video.